Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to FTA's Brexit webinar for the month of March. We hope that you are all tuned in and listening. We had hoped at the beginning of this week that we would be reporting to you the formal commencement of the Article 50 proceedings, because the government secured its ability to commence the leaving of the European Union. But unfortunately that was not to be the case, but there have been plenty of other developments in the past few weeks which we are able to report to you, not least the outcomes from FTA's first Brexit conference entitled Keep Britain Trading, which took place in the centre of London yesterday. The agenda for today is that we're mainly going to update you on a number of developments which have occurred on particular topics over the past few weeks, and make sure that you stay up to speed with all the developments as we know them. My name is James Hookham. I'm FTA's Deputy Chief Executive, and I'm joined this afternoon by Paul Ambassador, Head of European Policy and FTA's Brussels office. Just a reminder of the house rules for the webinar. So please keep your microphone or telephone on muted. We are recording the webinar, which means it will be available for download on the FTA website. And although we welcome your questions on the content, I'm afraid we won't be able to deal with technical issues about your reception or the webinar system. So please bear with us on that. Now, I'm sure most of you are familiar with the arrangements. The webinar software has a chat box through which you can ask us questions by typing in your questions, which we will see at this end. And we will do our best to answer them in the time available. But if we run out of time, then we will get back to you with the answers very shortly in the next few days. So, FTA continues to lead the agenda for logistics on Brexit, and we are still very concerned at the extent of impacts that Brexit might have on various aspects of FTA members' operations. The webinar today will deal mainly with the issues we've identified in our ABC guide to Brexit, and we'll work through that in just a moment. But there remains a huge number of issues that need to be resolved, and we continue to encourage members to join in with us either through freight councils or by emailing their views and opinions directly to us. And we have also established a new customs working group to deal with the very technical detail provisions of the new arrangements that may need to be introduced depending on the success or otherwise of the negotiations. Our microsite, fta.co.uk Brexit, continues to hold all relevant documents to Brexit activities that FTA has produced, and we will direct you there if you want further information about the matters that we're talking about. So let's get the main webinar underway, and I'm handing over Pauline now to commence the analysis of the latest developments.
Thank you, James. So we've heard, obviously, that Article 50 had not been triggered yet, as we had initially expected that it could be. But the bill that will give government the right to trigger Article 50 is now an act of Parliament. So obviously the triggering is now imminent, and our understanding is that it's likely to be triggered probably during the last week of March. To avoid clashing with celebrations for the 60th anniversary of the Rome Treaty, which basically founded what we know today as the European Union. So at the moment, the ball is very much in the UK's camp, and it's very much up to the UK government when Article 50 gets triggered. Once this is done, and once Article 50 has been triggered, the President of the European Council, Donald Tusk, is expected to answer within 48 hours. Admittedly, it's probably not going to be a very detailed answer, but he will call for an extraordinary meeting of heads of state and government. These council meetings take place as early as the 6th of April, which is the date sort of initially penciled down for such a meeting. Obviously, at that time, everyone had kind of expected government to trigger Article 50 earlier, so it could well be that this will be postponed. The Council is expected to set the broad guidelines and to ask the Commission to come up with more detailed recommendations for the way the negotiations should be conducted. So these Commission recommendations will be absolutely crucial because they will set the entire framework on which the future negotiations will be based. And we're not anticipating that these discussions on what to discuss when will be reopened later on. A meeting of the Commission is planned at the moment on the 7th of April to go through these guidelines for the negotiations at the highest levels in the European Commission. But obviously this meeting could be postponed, as I said, if Article 50 gets triggered a bit later than initially expected. The Council will need to adopt these guidelines, obviously, for these to be validated. So we're sort of expecting that process to probably end in May. April would be quite early, probably, so probably more likely May or June. And then, of course, the negotiations could start after that, but they are unlikely to start before the French elections, so probably not before sort of mid-May or even June/July in principle. So we've adopted a Brexit manifesto, which was sort of formally presented to government yesterday, and we were actually very pleased to hear government mention the details of the manifesto and saying that they'd sort of received the message loud and clear. This manifesto contains 10 core recommendations for government for the successful Brexit for logistics. And it focuses basically on 3 core streams: a global Britain, how to make the most of new international opportunities, accessing the EU market post-Brexit, and last but not least, making the most of Brexit domestically to build a stronger Britain. Now going to hand over back to James to take you through the ABC guide.
Well, as regular attendees at these webinars will know, FTA organises its thinking around Brexit using its ABC guide, and this is the starting point for all our presentations and briefings on Brexit. The number of activities and issues that are affected in the logistics sector is so wide, it's important that we don't see this as a single issue, but rather the aggregation of a large number of concerns in different parts of members' operations and interests. So the ABC guide is setting out the main headings under which we are considering the impacts of Brexit. We're going to give you a little bit more detailed information about our concerns and awareness of the issues around access to the single border, to the single market. There have been some developments around border controls, which we will tell you about, and some further detail on FTA's ideas about customs tariffs and procedures under different Brexit scenarios. So we're going to come back to A, B and C in some detail in the later part of the webinar. In the meanwhile, D is for domestic legislation, and as Pauline has been explaining, the process for bringing to Parliament the Great Reform Bill, which will copy and paste all existing European legislation into UK law, probably won't get underway until the Article 50 process has been triggered. Now, talking to MPs yesterday at our Brexit conference, they are very eager for this process to start, simply because they want to have another opportunity to debate the implications of Brexit in Parliament. But there is some doubt as to the precise timing around this. Some MPs expect the bill to be presented to Parliament very shortly after Article 50 is triggered, possibly in April or May. Other speculation suggests it won't actually come to the House until October. We'll just have to wait and see, but no substantial developments there. Neither is there anything particular to report on enforcement. There was budget, of course, budget statement by the Chancellor of the Exchequer last week, and of course that's back in the news today for possibly all the wrong reasons if you're the Chancellor, but not if you're a self-employed tradesman. But the other big outcome from the budget for us as regards fuel duty was, first of all, there was no increase in duty announced, but there again there was no decrease announced either, which is what we asked for. But more significantly, the government made announcements about its intention to consult over the course of the summer on the whole taxation strategy for diesel fuel, given the concerns about air quality and the fact that they would make decisions and announce the outcome of that review in the first autumn budget statement that the Chancellor will present probably in October or maybe November. So although it was a bit of a close run thing at the March budget, the government's made it clear that the taxation of diesel is unfinished business and they will return to it later in the year. They also announced a review of the road user levy that was introduced 3 years ago and mainly affects foreign registered vehicles visiting the UK. But that is another significant announcement and development, so much so that we've included it on our ABC guide under U for user levy, and I'll mention that again in just a moment. Not much to report on the issues around global markets. It was very encouraging at the Brexit conference yesterday to hear ministers recognising and endorsing FTA's support for expansion of Heathrow in order to give us a global air freight hub in this country after we leave the European Union. And we continue to develop important dialogue with the British and Irish institutions around the implications for the island of Ireland post-Brexit. And I expect we'll have a little bit more to say about Ireland at our next webinar in April. We'll be looking at the legal process for leaving in a little bit more detail in just a moment. We do not have a great deal to report on, unfortunately, on the status of non-UK workers working in the UK, which of course has massive implications for our ability to continue to employ those people as well as continue to recruit them. No further developments on rail freight, but you'll notice, those of you that follow this closely, we've added a new letter to the ABC. That is S is for Scotland, because of course at the beginning of the week, the First Minister of Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon, announced her intention to seek a second referendum, and we'll give you a little bit more detail and analysis of that decision and how it relates to the Brexit process in just a moment. As I mentioned, we've included a new letter U for user levy, and we will report more on that once the details of the consultation document has actually emerged. But let's take some detailed analysis now at the individual items, and we're going to start with access to the single market, and I'll hand back to Pauline for that.
Thank you, James. So what we do know at this stage is that the UK is not going to be a member of the single market or in a customs union with the EU post-Brexit, but that the UK will seek maximum access to the single market. So in light of this, the best option seems to be a free trade agreement between the UK and the EU post-Brexit. We know that sectoral deals are probably very unlikely because under WTO rules, free trade agreements need to cover substantially all the trade, which the EU tends to define as at least 90% of the trade. So obviously, just an agreement on, for instance, cars or dairy products would not be feasible, most likely. And the UK government has signalled their intention to follow the rules of WTO. So obviously they will probably not try to go against this principle. So what's at stake? Quite a few things. The future trade arrangements and procedures, of course, first of all. Will all the sectors retain maximum access to the single market? Traditionally, in free trade agreements, certain sectors tend to get excluded, such as agriculture, for instance. And what's going to be the degree of regulatory convergence? So we know that the Great Repeal Bill is obviously going to make sure that all EU laws are transformed into UK law at the point of exit. So there will not be any divergence in regulatory terms on the day of Brexit. But the question is there for the future because in order to bring about some simplification, for instance, Parliament might decide to then change some of the rules or repeal them. And this degree of regulatory convergence might no longer be there in the future. The default option, in case the two parties fail to agree on a specific free trade agreement in time, or just do not agree and leave the negotiating table without an agreement, is trade under WTO rules, i.e. no preferential access. Work is already underway to establish the UK's own schedules, covering trade in goods and services at the WTO. And we understand that the aim of government is to establish our schedules in a way that replicates, as far as possible, our current position as an EU member state. Obviously, with the WTO option, so for instance, if there is no deal, there are certain risks for trade and for our members. The first one, the obvious one, is of course tariffs that would be faced by UK products exported to the EU. So looking at the current set of schedules, we're talking about tariffs of about 30% for confectionery, for instance, 10% for cars, or 35% for dairy products, just to give you some examples. What would be the customs procedures as well? It's quite unclear if there's no specific agreement that sort of sets that out more clearly. Will there be any time to adapt? Will there be time for a phased implementation? If there is no deal, this is quite unlikely. And last but not least, will UK products still be recognized as equivalent to EU products? This is not necessarily a given, so worth bearing in mind, and we've certainly pressed that point onto government officials who attended our Keep Britain trading event yesterday. So moving on to borders, the first issue, of course, is the issue of juxtaposed controls for immigration controls. At the moment, the UK border is in Calais, because of a bilateral treaty called Le Touquet Agreement. But there have been, and there are still, calls for renegotiations of this bilateral agreement in France. And as you might know, there are presidential elections that are coming up. So at the moment, we're in electoral campaign in France. And some leading candidates have specifically called for renegotiation of this treaty. The issue, of course, is that restricted space in the UK means that service frequency could be de facto limited. We're also looking at delays resulting from potential customs checks, which could obviously have similar negative impacts. So we've assessed that the cost of 1 minute of delay for one truck would be £3.21. If you multiply that by the number of trucks going through Dover and Calais, for instance, you then get a pretty big bill. So this is obviously something to be avoided, and we're asking government to make sure that it does not happen. So as I said, we're really trying to model the cost and the impact this could have, and you can be sure that this will feature prominently in our future webinars. So moving to customs, I'm going to hand over to James to take you through the customs bits.
Thanks, Pauline. So as we've been saying, the degree to which the UK retains access to the single market will very much determine the extent of the customs controls that may need to be introduced. Now, the Prime Minister has made it clear that the UK will leave the customs union. She's made that statement in her Lancaster House speech in the middle of January. But almost in the same breath, she said that one of her negotiating objectives is to retain the frictionless trade, as she called it, with the EU through negotiation. Now, that is a very demanding agenda for the negotiations, because effectively the Prime Minister is wanting her cake and eating it. So she wants all the benefits of trade, but without all of the other requirements that come with it, in particular the free movement of people and the jurisdiction of the European courts. Now, we must leave it to the negotiation process to see how the British objectives are progressed and achieved. But in the meantime, FTA is beginning to make assessment as to what the likely outcomes will be, so as to allow members to start planning for different scenarios which may emerge. And at this stage, we're beginning to categorise the outcomes under three headings. First of all, there is no friction in the trading procedures, frictionless trade, as the Prime Minister called it, and that is effectively the same arrangements that prevail at the moment. So although the UK has left the European Union and the Customs Union through some magic of negotiation, we still have managed to have no customs controls, no tariffs, and no other further checks just at present. And given the political red lines that the government have already identified, FTA is categorising that as probably unachievable. And whilst it would be wonderful if it were, I think we should be realistic about the chances of that actually coming through, given the government's other priorities. So we should be planning for some kind of controls to be imposed in the category we're calling low friction. And wherever possible, FTA will influence the government to ensure that any new controls that are introduced on UK-EU trade, their impact is minimised by the use of new innovative techniques. FTA's new customs working group is considering a paper to put to HMRC, which puts some detail around this, but effectively we're looking at the way in which new computerised, probably online declaration systems can be used to allow the considerable number of declarations that will need to be made to be done online. We are very keen to pursue the idea of fast track arrangements for accredited shippers and carriers, because this will take the burden off of the customs declarations if a majority of goods can be cleared by virtue of them being known consignors or known carriers. So that is a high priority for us in our discussions with HMRC. And another option that is being considered and was promoted with some vigour at our conference yesterday was the possibility of increasing the threshold for low value goods, and certainly exempting them from VAT payments, if not from full customs declarations. So these are ways that new customs controls, or the impacts of new customs controls, could be mitigated. FTA is making representations on these points to HMRC with the hope and expectation that they will be factored into the government's negotiations, although of course we will have to wait, possibly for 2 or more years, to find out whether we were successful or not. The third category is high friction, and this is where effectively the negotiations have broken down or have gone very badly, and the government is coming away from the negotiations with a lot of additional requirements needing to be imposed and possibly no agreement being reached. In that scenario, what are known as the WTO rules, the World Trade Organization rules, will apply. These are the baseline or default rules which all countries that have not got their own free trade agreement with the European Union have to comply. So it's effectively full-on declarations, full-on tariffs. It's easily the most painful and most expensive outcome. But if the negotiations go well, or the Prime Minister, as she says, walks away because, in her words, no deal is better than a bad deal, then this will be the consequence for international trade shipments and will be the scenario that FTA and its members will need to think through. Now, as our discussions with members and indeed with HMRC develop, we will supplement the information that we're able to give under this heading But again, I encourage you, if you have a particular stake and interest in international trade and are interested in influencing and working with us to get these ideas right, then please do let us know. Your membership and participation of the Customs Working Group would be valued, and we would welcome you into the process at this early stage. Now, we have identified our 5 red lines in terms of what we need to achieve in terms of a negotiated settlement on the UK-EU trade under our 5 headings here, which we've called our clean agenda. So there are 5 issues that we're particularly wanting to make sure are factored into these negotiations. First of all, and this has been the subject of some press speculation recently, there is concern that the capability of customs IT systems being able to cope with all the additional trade that will need to be declared. And in very round numbers, at the moment there are about 90 million declarations made for non-EU trade at the moment. If you include all the EU trade, because we have a low or high friction outcome to the negotiations, then you're looking at about another 300 million declarations. And at the moment, frankly, FTA is not convinced that our customs declaration systems can cope with that scale of increased traffic through them. I'm happy to be reassured and convinced on that by HMRC, but that remains one of our most important factors, the fact that the HMRC itself cannot cope with this additional workload. And even if we do get a capable system installed by customs, then we do need to recognise, or government needs to recognise, that industry itself needs to learn how to use it. So it's important that there is some kind of transitional period during which industry can learn the new requirements, simply because it's about 24 years since any business in the UK that has trade with the EU has had to make a customs declaration for goods that might be sold onto the continent, or indeed into Ireland. Of course, all the customs declarations were removed back at the end of 1992. The third issue is whether we've got the same recognition of our arrangements in other European customs agencies. It's no good the Brits thinking they've got it right if no one else in the EU recognises the arrangements. So we do need reciprocity and equivalent procedures elsewhere. One of the big practical consequences of introducing customs checks is that HMRC want to make physical checks on vehicles and containers, and given the restrictions on trade, on space and time in modern supply chains, we are urging that those checks, if they are made, are not actually made in the port or indeed airport areas. There's not space, there's not time, and if we can get a smart system together which allows pre-clearance, there's no actual need to make physical checks on vehicles at the border. The fifth and final one is whatever arrangements are made, we can't have a sudden transition from one to the other. We will need a sensible introductory period, so please, government, no cliff edge in transition from the current arrangements to whatever might prevail in the future. So the Prime Minister said she wants a clean Brexit rather than a hard or soft one. So FTA has given an interpretation what a clean Brexit would mean in the interests of its members. Not certain it will quite attract the political currency that we might be looking for, but at least it's a useful way of summarising what FTA's priorities are. I'm handing back to Pauline now to deal with some detail around the leaving process.
Thank you, James. So basically, as I said, the ball is very much in the UK's court at the moment. The Prime Minister is expected to trigger Article 50 by the end of this month, after which, of course, the Council, minus the UK, will need to agree guidelines for the EU negotiations. It's, however, important to note that the 2-year period to negotiate starts on the point when Article 50 gets triggered. So even if the guidelines and the actual negotiations start later, the clock will start ticking on the day Article 50 is triggered. The future relationship might or might not be decided at this stage, It could well be that discussions go in two phases, with a first phase focused more on the withdrawal arrangements per se, including the situation of non-UK EU workers in the UK and UK citizens living in the EU. After this 2-year period, if a deal is reached, then the UK lives and the new arrangements would apply, and we know that there would probably be a phased period of implementation to allow everyone to sort of get up to speed and adapt to the new rules. Obviously, if no deal is reached, then either the negotiations could be extended, which requires unanimous approval and therefore unlikely, or if no extension is secured, the EU treaties cease to apply anyway, and WTO rules would apply until the UK has negotiated a free trade agreement. So you can see on this slide basically the pictures of the key negotiators, the key people that are going to be involved in the negotiations from the EU 27 side. So the President of the European Council, Donald Tusk, the Council has the role to basically set out the guidelines for the negotiations. They can delegate detail of the negotiations to the European Commission, but if they don't do it, they would effectively be responsible for doing the negotiations directly. But we're very much expected the Commission to be tasked with this. They would conclude the agreement also with the UK with qualified majority. The European Commission has set up a task force, which is led by Michel Barnier. You can see his picture on this slide. He's going to be the chief negotiator for the Commission and very much likely to lead the detail of negotiations. His services, and the services of the European Commission at large, will most probably provide technical expertise and are likely to lead on trade negotiations, because a lot of trade negotiators would be in the services and not necessarily only in the task force. The European Parliament will also have an important role. Will need to provide its consent before the Council can conclude the agreement with the UK. And you can see here the picture of the leader on this in the European Parliament, Guy Verhofstadt. So I'm now going to hand over to James again to update you on the latest developments in Scotland.
As we said, we have taken the decision that we need to add Scotland to our list of Brexit concerns. As I'm sure you noticed in the news, at the beginning of this week, Nicola Sturgeon, the First Minister of Scotland, announced that she would be making formal application to the Westminster Government to hold for permission to hold a second referendum on Scottish independence. Now, clearly there was a lot of political intrigue around her decision and timing. That's not for our concern, but what is of course of concern is the prospect of raising, first of all, an additional complication in the Brexit negotiations, which may need to be factored into FTA's work. And secondly, of course, independent of Brexit, there are major implications for a formal an independent Scotland possibly adopting different rules and requirements for transport and effectively the emergence of a hard border between England and Scotland. And whatever problems you think might emerge from a Brexit, an exit from the European Union for the UK, and of course the implications are as equally profound for Anglo-Scottish traffic should there be some kind of border control introduced at that point. Now, this of course is far from being settled. Ms Sturgeon made a request or an expectation that she would be holding her referendum possibly in 2018. Although they've not formally responded, the expectation is the government will not want a second Scottish referendum until after the Brexit negotiations have been completed, which at the very earliest would put them into 2019. We will let that political process play out. Needless to say, it will be something that FTA keeps a close eye on and continues to report on as those negotiations develop. Back to Pauline then for practical implications of Brexit.
Thank you, James. So basically, to sum it up, in the pre-Brexit period, which is basically the period before the withdrawal agreement is negotiated, until the UK leaves the EU, no radical changes. All the EU rules and regulations apply, and we know that they will continue to apply at least on day one after Brexit. But obviously, fluctuations in the pounds have already had some impact, and many of you might have already started thinking about what the impact of Brexit might be on their business and how they wish to organise their supply chain in the future. Post-Brexit, the extent of changes will very much depend on the content of the UK deal with the EU, and obviously if there is a deal or not. But for us, low-friction trade procedures will definitely be a priority, as outlined in our manifesto. So now a bit on what FT is doing. So basically we're keeping close contact with all new government departments, as well as, of course, as the Department for Transport, HMRC and the Treasury. We're, of course, also in contact with the key players at European level and very much active in Brussels. We've commissioned research on what are the various scenarios and options that could play out, and the benefits and merits of the various options, as well as the downsides. We're consulting members very regularly. There will be another round of councils in the various regions and nations, and we very much encourage you to take part in these consultations. Obviously, we'll keep organising these webinars. We've adopted, as we said at the beginning, our Brexit manifesto, and you can see a picture of the cover here. And we had yesterday as well a big event with government called Keep Britain Trading, and it's probably not going to be the last one of the kind that we organise. So our plea to you is really to join in with FTA, attend our freight councils that focus on all the modes of transport and all the different interests of the different parts of the supply chain. When we do have consultations, surveys and so on, to really make sure that you take part in this, because we'll only be able to form accurate views of what's needed for logistics with your help as members. We'll be organising again transport manager seminars where Brexit is likely to feature quite prominently, and as I said, we'll also organise on a monthly basis our free Brexit webinars. In the interest of time, we won't be able to take questions, unfortunately, but if you do have questions, please input them either directly into the webinar facility, or you can email us as well, and we'll always be happy to answer these. I'm now going to hand over to James for the conclusion of the webinar.
Thank you, Pauline. Our next webinar is scheduled for the 20th of April, starting at 11:30, and there's a further one on the 18th of May at the same time. So by the time that we meet again, no doubt Article 50 will have been triggered, unless the Prime Minister is going to be very disappointed. And I expect we'll be able to give you a little bit more detail about our customs charter, the detailed requirements that FTA members have agreed need to be factored into the negotiations to keep international trade as frictionless as possible. If there are particular areas that you want to hear more about, or you think there are issues that we are overlooking, please do let us know. We will be very pleased to hear from you. But at just coming up to 3:10, I'm going to close the webinar. Thank you for your attendance. Thank you for your continued interest. And Pauline and I look forward to speaking with you next month. Thank you very much and good afternoon.